The light from the alchemist's furnace cast long, distorted shadows across the stone walls of Château de Tiffauges. In these dancing silhouettes, a nobleman once celebrated as a hero of France watched intently, seeking visions of gold and power in the flames. But what Gilles de Rais truly conjured in those chambers was something far darker, an abyss that would transform a decorated marshal of France into history's most notorious aristocratic predator. As children disappeared from villages surrounding his estates, whispers began. The lord of the castle was hunting prey more innocent than any game in his forests. Born in 1405 to one of the wealthiest and most distinguished families in Brittany, Gilles de Rais seemed destined for glory. Orphaned young and raised by his maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, he inherited vast estates across western France before he reached adulthood. The boy who would become monster grew up in the turbulent final years of the 100 Years' War, a time when violence permeated daily life and death was a constant companion. For a young nobleman, war was not merely inevitable, but the primary path to distinction, and Gilles pursued martial glory with singular determination. His opportunity came with the arrival of Joan of Arc in 1429. Fighting alongside the Maid of Orléans, Gilles distinguished himself through exceptional courage and tactical skill. At 24, he was appointed Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the kingdom. Standing beside Joan at the coronation of Charles de Sand at Reims Cathedral, Gilles reached the zenith of his public glory, a golden figure in armor, celebrated throughout France as one of the king's most valiant defenders. What no one could see beneath the gleaming armor was the psychological fracturing already underway. The brutal realities of medieval warfare had exposed the young nobleman to extreme violence from an early age. In battle, he had not merely witnessed, but actively participated in acts of savagery, considered honorable in the context of war. The line between sanctioned violence and forbidden cruelty, always thin in the medieval mind, had perhaps already begun to blur in his consciousness. Joan's capture and execution in 1431 marked a critical turning point. Some historians suggest Gilles experienced her death as a profound psychological blow, perhaps even a crisis of faith. The woman he had fought beside, whom many believed divinely inspired, had been abandoned by the king they had helped crown and burned as a heretic. If God allowed such a fate for Joan, what divine constraints truly existed in this world? Retiring from military life to his estates, Gilles began a transformation that bewildered contemporaries. The disciplined soldier became a man of extravagant excess. He staged elaborate theatrical spectacles, spending vast sums on productions that featured hundreds of performers, lavish costumes, and mechanical special effects that astonished audiences. These performances often featured religious themes, perhaps reflecting an obsessive attempt to reconnect with the divine certainty he had lost. As his wealth diminished under such expenses, Gilles turned to darker pursuits. Convinced that supernatural forces could restore his fortunes, he surrounded himself with alchemists and occultists who promised to transform base metals into gold or summon demons who would reveal hidden treasures. The chateau cellars witnessed increasingly elaborate rituals involving exotic incense, intricate sigils drawn in chalk and blood, and incantations in languages Gilles himself did not understand. It was in this atmosphere of occult, exploration, and financial desperation that his most horrific crimes began. Between 1432 and 1440, villages around his estates reported children vanishing without trace, peasant children at first, then children of artisans and merchants. Contemporary accounts would later place the number of victims between 80 and 200, though modern historians generally consider the lower end of this range more plausible. The children, primarily boys between 6 and 14, simply disappeared while running errands or tending livestock near his properties. What happened behind the castle walls defies simple narration. Court testimony would later describe how Gilles, often dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes, would evaluate the children brought to him, selecting those he found most appealing. The children were fed and treated well initially, even given fine clothes. Then, typically at night, they would be taken to Gilles' private chambers where he would hang them from hooks, caress and comfort them as they faced their end, then engage in acts of sadistic violation both before and after their deaths. Some accounts suggest he sat on their stomachs as they died, watching the light leave their eyes with fascination. Afterwards, their bodies were burned in the castle fireplace, their ashes dumped in the moat. The psychology behind such extreme sadism remains the subject of intense speculation. Some historians suggest Gilles suffered from mental illness exacerbated by battlefield trauma. Others point to childhood experiences, while little is known of his early years. His parents' death and subsequent raise by a grandfather known for harshness may have created attachment disorders. Modern psychological profiles often suggest a combination of narcissistic personality disorder and sexual sadism, possibly with psychopathic traits that prevented empathy for his victims. Perhaps most disturbing was Gilles' ability to compartmentalize. The same man who engaged in unspeakable acts at night maintained a public persona of aristocratic dignity and piety. He attended Mass daily, funded religious establishments, and continued to be received at court. His ability to separate his secret self from his public identity allowed his crimes to continue for years, protected by his status and the reluctance of peasants to accuse a powerful lord. This double life extended to his own self-perception. In his confession, Gilles would claim he committed his crimes to pleasure himself, yet he simultaneously portrayed himself as a devout Christian. This cognitive dissonance suggests a fractured psyche, perhaps indicating he had cordoned off his sadistic impulses from his conscious moral identity. Only when under extreme duress during his trial did these compartments collapse, producing his extraordinary confession. The end came not from the discovery of his sadistic crimes, but from a financial and political miscalculation. In 1440, desperate for money, Gilles violated the sanctity of a church by kidnapping a cleric during a financial dispute. This sacrilege gave the ecclesiastical courts jurisdiction over him and provided his political enemies, particularly Duke Jean IV of Brittany, who coveted his lands, the opening they needed. Once arrested, the investigation quickly expanded beyond the original charge as witnesses came forward with accounts of missing children. The trial that followed revealed horrors that shocked even a society accustomed to violence. Servants testified to luring children to the castle and witnessing their torture and murder. Parents described children who had gone to Tiffauges, seeking work, and never returned. Most dramatically, Gilles himself, after initial denials, confessed in extraordinary detail to crimes the court found almost beyond comprehension. His confession reveals a man struggling to understand his own darkness. "I did it to pleasure myself," he stated simply when asked his motives, yet elsewhere he blamed demonic influence and the pursuit of knowledge through alchemy and magic. He described killing many children, I don't know how many, with a detachment that horrified his judges. Yet as his execution approached, he displayed what appeared to be genuine remorse, asking forgiveness from the parents of his victims and requesting his body be buried with the innocents he had harmed. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was hanged and then burned at Nantes. Historical accounts suggest he faced his end with composure and apparent penitence that moved many witnesses. His final speech reportedly urged parents to raise their children in virtue and discipline, an extraordinary statement from a man condemned for destroying so many young lives. The psychological enigma of Gilles de Rais continues to haunt historians and psychologists. How could the brave companion of Joan of Arc transform into a predator of children? What inner alchemy turned glory into depravity? Some suggest his military career provided socially sanctioned expression for sadistic impulses that later found outlet in criminal violence. Others point to the theatrical nature of his crimes, the ceremonial robes, the elaborate staging, as evidence that he had created an alternate reality where normal moral constraints no longer applied. Perhaps most disturbing is how long his crimes continued undetected. Protected by nobility in a society where class differences were viewed as divinely ordained, Gilles operated with near impunity. Peasant families who lost children had little recourse against a Marshal of France. The very social structures designed to maintain order instead sheltered a predator in their midst. The legacy of Gilles de Rais resonates beyond his personal pathology. His story became intertwined with the folk tale of Bluebeard, the nobleman who murdered his wives and hid their bodies in a forbidden chamber. His crimes helped establish the archetype of the aristocratic sadist that would later find expression in works like the Marquis de Sade's writings and Gothic literature's obsession with corrupt nobility. In his transformation from hero to monster, we see reflected anxieties about the nature of power and the fragility of the social contracts that constrain humanity's darkest impulses. The stones of Tiffauges still stand in western France, a tourist attraction where families now picnic in the shadow of chambers that once witnessed unspeakable suffering. The site's museum mentions Gilles's crimes, but emphasizes his military career alongside Joan. This sanitization reflects our continuing discomfort with the darkest chapters of human behavior, the knowledge that beneath the armor of our heroes, behind the walls of our most impressive institutions, lurks the potential for abominations we can scarcely bring ourselves to name. As twilight falls on Tiffauges Castle each evening, the shadows return, stretching across grounds where children once disappeared without trace. In that gathering darkness, a disquieting thought emerges that the distance between Gilles de Rais and ourselves may not be measured in centuries but in circumstances, and the monster who haunts these ruins is not so much a medieval aberration as a reflection of what slumbers in the human heart, waiting only for the right conditions to awaken.